Good afternoon. Or good noon, like it's literally noon right now. So good noon, good noon. Oh, Facebook, always giving me the tips. Giving me like another tip. Thanks for the tips. Just makes me want to click things over there. Woo! Hang on, we're telling more followers to join your video. Well, thanks, Instagram. That's really nice of you to do that for me. Instagram wants more and more engagement. Of course they do. So they're like, please, let's tell your followers for you, shall we? All right. Go ahead and do that. Why don't you? I think I just spilled a little. You're welcome. All authentic all the time over here. All authentic all the time. What's going on over there? Going on over there on Instagram? Doesn't look like things are moving so much, but that's okay. Usually it's Facebook I'm on. I'm like, what's going on Facebook? But today on Facebook seems like so far so good. So far so good. Yay, Facebook friends. We might even get through it today without me like being mean to Facebook. What do you know? What do you know? Maybe I need to hang on. Maybe I need to just like tell those folks over at Instagram to, well, maybe not. Okay, here we go. Good Friday afternoon. It is 2 minutes past noon now, my time. So good Friday afternoon here in Toronto, north of Toronto, of course, north of Toronto, about 45 minutes north of Toronto, in the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe. Sorry, I've been missing a syllable on that one, so I wanted to make sure that I got that correct. And the Mississauga and Wendat people. Hi, Bianca. Yay, people are here. And my name is Dr. Shannon Coates, and my pronouns are she, they. So here we are. Today is Friday, so these are some live office hours from Friday. And as you may know, on Fridays I try to talk a little bit more about things that are a little bit more philosophical, a little more along the lines of sort of pedagogy rather than technical on Fridays. And so that is where I'm going to go today. And what I wanted to talk about today is something that as with many things, as I'm working with teachers and developing courses, the Vocal Instrument 101, by the way, online course, if you had thought about taking that before, it is there, and third anniversary sale, so take a look at that for the month of December. And as I'm developing the Voice Ped degree, you can get some more information on that on my website as well. And as I work with voice teachers, and especially as I work with beginning voice teachers, there are a lot of different concepts that kind of come up and that I'm making connections to and saying, I think this is an important, way to change the way that we're teaching, and to change the kind of narrative around what you're supposed to do as a teacher, as a voice teacher especially. And a lot of those things have come out of, my own experience and working with singers myself, and then as I'm working with teachers, as I'm observing teachers teaching and saying, oh, let's change language this way. So a lot of those concepts are things that I am sort of reaching for and saying, I think we need to do this, this, and this. And then as I'm reaching for them, of course, someone somewhere has already, qualified it, has already, put it in a box, put that concept in a box and given it a name. So, and then, sometimes I'm very lucky to act as I'm thinking about the thing, to kind of come across the person or the idea in that box or with that name already. So this is one of those things. Something that and if you've followed me at all, or have listened to any of my lives at some point, you may have already heard this concept where I'm trying to articulate this concept of feedback and how we give feedback, and how best to give feedback, and how best to sort of trigger the deeper learning that we're looking for, and also marrying that with working with an internal instrument that you can't see, and in some cases you can't really feel. It's challenging to be able to sort of say exactly what's happening, especially as if you're doing the singing yourself, or if you're, a new teacher and you don't have the same language perhaps, or understanding what's going on. So this concept of feedback, I've been playing with for a very long time, and how we give feedback and how we structure feedback. And then, like I said, I came across just this week, this concept of feed forward. And this kind of really combines a whole bunch of things into one concept that I didn't know it was already a named and established thing, quantified thing, and I'm happy for that. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit here, so I did a little bit of research on this, and I just want to get some of the names out there. So Marshall Goldsmith, who apparently is a management expert, or was a management expert, is the first person, as far as I can tell, to have kind of coined this concept, or at least put this concept into kind of a box and then put a name on it. So as far as I can tell. And then Joe Hirsch is someone who has a book called The Feedback Fix. So that is something that is now on my Amazon wish list. So The Feedback Fix. And I came across this concept through something called The Cult of Pedagogy. So not my favorite word, obviously, like the cult of pedagogy. But on the other hand, really got your attention, right? And that was founded by Jennifer Gonzalez. So those, I'll put a few links into the Facebook comments as well afterwards, just so that you've got a few of those to look at if you want to. But that's the genesis. And then what I want to do is just kind of outline this concept a little bit, and then how do we apply it in the voice studio. So traditional feedback, as you know, is where we comment on what has already happened, right? So we're like, okay, they sing an exercise, and then we're like, all right, so that was this and this and this, and now do this and this and this. And so we have this kind of like feedback, oral feedback, and we have talked about better ways to give that kind of feedback and all that kind of thing before as well. But in the sort of traditional sense, right? We like, you sing the thing, I as the teacher, I'm like, and here's what you did, blah, 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 and like, here's what we want to change, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So that's the sort of traditional feedback concept. And one of the reasons that I have talked about different ways of giving feedback, and perhaps more effective ways of giving feedback, is because this kind of feedback, there are a couple of issues with it. One is that it is quite top down, right? Which is not what we're looking for in terms of terrific learning in the voice studio. What we want is more student-led, right? So this kind of like, you do the thing and then I tell you what happened in the thing, is quite top down. And I think many of us have moved into a far more collaborative, student-led assessment, if you will, feedback process, certainly. But that has been modeled overall, and so that is still can be part of how we are providing feedback. And the other thing about this that isn't my favorite is that because it's top down, or tends to be top down, we tend to lose the opinion or the agency of the student in assessing what they did and then what they want. So we tend to lose student agency, right? Because we tend to sort of start driving the bus here, because here's the thing you did, here's the thing that didn't work well, and now here's the thing that we want to change so that you can make it work better, right? So that tends to take away agency, student agency, in a bunch of different ways. One of them being that they may not be then thinking about what it is that they want, and they start to move into what you want, right? And they start to try to please you. And the other thing is, as I said, in terms of the agency, they aren't necessarily developing their own internal process for whether or not this was actually what I want. And then how do I change the thing if it's not what I wanted? So that's one of my issues. One of the other issues I think is that, so it tends to be expert focused is what I think Joe Hirsch calls it. And it tends to be assessment focused rather than development focused. So we tend to sort of, in sort of traditional feedback, we tend to focus on the thing that wasn't successful, right? We tend to focus on that. And of course, we've talked about ways where we're not going to focus on the thing that wasn't successful. We're going to ask for what we want. But it tends to focus on what wasn't successful in order to improve the thing, rather than having a forward focus, right? So it tends to be like, where's the thing that didn't work? Let me point that out, because that's what you're paying me all this money for. And now let me tell you how to make it the thing that it could have been, right? Let me tell you how to make it the coordination or whatever that it could have been. And now try it again. So it tends to be expert focused, or expert dominant, if you will. It tends to be assessment focused, and it also is can be a frustration point, because I can't go back and fix the thing that I did, right? Especially not in something like singing, where as soon as I've done, yes, oh good, I'm so glad. So as soon as I've done the thing, it's now done, right? We're not creating art. We are creating art. We're not creating fine art, right? We're not creating sculptures where, to a certain extent, I can go back and like change something if I want to. As soon as it's out there and it's done. I can't go back and change, right? There's a temporal aspect to what we do as singers. So, and as musicians, of course. But so as the feedback aspect can be very challenging for brains, specifically for brains. Even when we do the typical like sandwich, where we're like, you did this really well and this sucked, and then you did this really well. I'm sure no one is using that terminology, but when we do the feedback sandwich, we often, that little chunk of, you didn't do this very well, or this didn't work, that little chunk, especially if it's not worded well, can be very detrimental, because I can't go back and change it anyway, right? Like I can't go back and change what I sang or how I did the thing. So that can actually be quite, trauma is a too strong a word, I apologize, although for some folks it can be actually traumatic. And can produce a dysregulation because of experiences and not being able to change things, and feeling less than, and feeling the frustration of not being good enough, right? So there can be a little bit of there may be a trauma response, and again, I don't want to use those words lightly. So maybe a better way to say it is that there can be some emotional and I mean, people can get defensive, right? And why? Of course they're going to get defensive if we're talking about something that can't be changed. So those are the three things about feedback. And again, feedback can be done in a better way than this sort of traditional model. I'm kind of pointing out all of the things that aren't great about feedback and all of the things in the sort of traditional way that we do it, right? But here's what feed forward does. Here's where we kind of change the narrative a little bit and change our emotionally uncomfortable. Let's say that. Yeah, emotionally uncomfortable. So here's where we go with feed forward. Feed forward changes the perspective or the focus of the information that we're giving from what's past to what's coming. So it changes the entire focus, right? So this is what we would call a directive in the voice studio. So we change from the thing that I'm going to be able to tell you what to do once I've heard what you're already doing, which in some ways is perfectly reasonable, and there are lots of ways to do this in a good way as well, right? In a pedagogically sound way. So, but it changes from that to very much more student-led, very much it takes those directives, and we can be very much more intentional about, with the student, a collaborative approach with the student, rather than the expert rather than the expert top-down approach. So if we're working on feed forward, we're giving a directive before the creation of the sound. So we're giving a directive before the actual outcome, before that tonal outcome is created, before the coordination is there. We're giving a directive beforehand. And this directive then, I'm going to give some examples in a minute, but so this directive then, like I said, can be built with the student. So rather than, it can be built with the student. So let me make sure I stay on track here. And so more collaborative, more forward-looking, and we start to use language for what I want to see or what the student wants to see, rather than what I don't want to see. So, how many times has a student come into the, come into the studio and said, like, I need to get rid of my nasality, or I need to, I have a lot of tongue tension, or my jaw is super tight, or my sound is too far back, or my vibrato is too wide, or blah, 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 right? How many times have you had students come into the studio who someone somewhere has given them that feedback where the focus is on the thing that isn't working rather than asking for the thing that I want, right? So then if we're working on feed forward, then we start to say, okay, so what do you want to sound like? So you do want to sound, so if they say, I don't, okay, so what do we, and we start with this collaborative, student-led, what do you want to sound like? Who are your favorite singers? Who are the artists that really bring you to, really speak to you? And not just what do you want to sound like, but what do you want to say? And of course, we've talked about this quite a bit. What is your why? What do you want to say? What do you want to communicate? Who are you, and why is it important for you to communicate? So once we're starting to ask those questions, the tonal outcome starts to be much more clear in terms of what we actually want on that outside. And then we start to frame that tonal outcome as a development towards something, rather than as you did it this way before and now you have to change to this, right? We start to frame it as a forward looking process, as a development process, rather than an assessment of what we did before. So if someone then says, well, I just don't want to sound nasal, okay, let's dig into that. What do you want to sound like? And then why? So not sounding nasal is not a thing, right? I can't teach you to not sound nasal. I have to teach you to do something. And teaching you is maybe the wrong, I want to change that terminology. Let's say I can't work with you. We can't work together to do a negative. We have to work together to get to a positive. We have to work together to get you to do something. We have to, I say this all the time, ask for what you want, not for what you don't want, right? And I put the not right in there, so it's not a great saying, but ask for what you want. So if and this is what you're going to require the student to do this for themselves as well, right? The student becomes part of the feed forward process, where the student then has agency in their development because they're at the front of the development and of the process, and they're leading what they want. They're leading with what they want. So they say, sorry, I keep coming back to this and not quite finishing it. So they say, I just don't want to sound nasal, for example. And so then you get to have a conversation about what do you want to sound like, why, who in your ear doesn't sound, who in your ear sounds like the way that you want to sound, and what will you communicate better by sounding in this way, by creating these tonal outcomes. What are you going to be able to communicate? What is going to be, what is so important about this specific tonal outcome for you? What is the importance of it? And friends, this is so important in our contemporary styles, our popular music styles, of course, and it is also important in Western classical singing. This gets lost so easily in Western classical singing because of how specific all of those parameters are and the coordination is around creating very specific tonal outcomes, right? So it gets lost so easily, this student-led and why do you want to sound this way? You can't want to sound this way because your teacher wants you to. You can't want to sound, not even in Western classical singing, you can't want to sound this way because you won't be heard on stage otherwise. That's not a good enough reason. It's not a good enough reason in Western classical singing to want to sound this way, or to want to have these specific coordinations, right? It's not a good enough reason. It is part of the reason for sure, but it's not a good enough reason for you to lead. If the only reason that you want to sound like a certain, a specific Western classical sound, or the reason that you're taking lessons is because I can't be heard on stage, and so I need to learn a better coordination in order to be heard on stage, that gives away your agency. That gives away your agency. You need to find a better reason. You can't be heard on stage. Why is it important that you're heard on stage? Why is it important that what you say and the way that you sing and the way that you use your voice is heard? That has to be the driving factor. It doesn't matter whether you're singing Western classical or not, right? And let me just see here. Is there too much focus on the negative? We asked, why don't you want to sound this way? So that is possible. I'm not sure. Yes, because I want to have a successful career. Not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. Absolutely, I agree. So that's a great question. Whether we ask the negative, right? Ask the other side, like why don't you want to sound this way? Definitely, I think just tread carefully, right? I think there's always going to be some good information there, and you may get some information from like, why don't you sound this way? Don't want to sound this way because so-and-so told me that I sounded that way, right? So you may get that kind of information, and so then you have the opportunity to say, okay, so what do you really want? Yeah. So I think you just have to tread carefully, I think, and I think if you're very clear about the reason to have this information and to work with the student to find this information, if you're very clear about that, then you're going to be guiding toward what do you want, all the time anyway. So I think you can kind of get into the why don't you want it a little bit. Fine, and then you'll be able to kind of come back and refocus to what do you want, and then what's the tonal outcome that we're looking for. So this also, let me make sure, what sound, what emotion, what are you communicating? All of that becomes, all of that becomes student-led, and then the actual feedback, like the other side then, rather than becoming an assessment from us as voice teachers as to whether or not you were successful. I mean, sometimes it is necessary in some ways. That we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, of course, but being intentional about not always being the one in charge of the feedback, right? So because then once we have a strong understanding of where I want to go, what I want to say, what my role as the singer is, and my sense of agency and in the student in the lesson room, then when someone so then the directives, let me get there first. So then the directives become feed forward. So the directives become, okay, we're working toward saying this thing. We're working toward, in this exercise or in this song, you're going to communicate this thing. So in order to communicate this thing, where do you need to get, what kind of emotional intention or engagement do you need? Where do you need to get, and if we're talking about Western classical singing, what colors do we need to use here? Where do we need to get a little bit more clarity perhaps in the tonal outcome? And this is also where listening comes in, very intentional listening comes in is very powerful, where we are listening to either artists who, and in Western classical singing, so many wonderful artists out there, where we're listening to artists, I mean, Western classical singing, this applies in Western classical singing, and then of course there are so many wonderful other artists along with Western classical singing, singers who we can listen to for inspiration, but also who we can listen to for that ease of communication. So we start to, our ear, our inner ear, not the like actual physical inner ear, our brain, gets the sound, if you will, of ease and of communication and what that coordination sounds like. And then we work toward that coordination, or we work toward, not toward the coordination, we do the feed forward where we're saying, and now this part, because you want to have the intensity there, and I'm going to come back to Western classical here, because you want to have the intensity in this specific, song, or because this character needs to have a specific kind of intensity, what would it sound like if you coordinated like Maria Callas, for example, Callas? What would it sound like if you coordinated like Pavarotti here? Not sounding like them, necessarily, coordinating like them, creating communication like they do. Same thing with all of our other, contemporary and popular musics, folks. This is not about, and to be clear, this isn't about copying, right? There's some mimicking for sure, but it's not about copying. This is about having the sound in your ear so that you can create a feed forward loop so that I'm going toward a thing rather than trying to correct a thing that I did before. So I'm going toward a thing, I'm coordinating toward a tonal outcome or toward a communication level rather than trying to correct whatever didn't work before. So what this puts into place then is we change to this forward-looking perspective. We change to this, we come out of, we basically allow ourselves to come into a student-led collaborative lesson structure and lesson atmosphere. So we come out of the expert-led, we come out of the top-down. We move into a better way of learning for the brain. So the brain can coordinate better if I know where I'm going. Then, we know this from learning, and I know this from doing everything I possibly can with Heidi Moss, but we know that the brain coordinates better, that we will have better coordination if we know where we're going, if we're going toward a thing, rather than, or we're developing a thing, rather than if we're trying to correct mistakes. That's not a great way for the brain to coordinate. It just doesn't, it's not as effective. It's just not. So the learning is deeper, and the students have more agency in the lesson and in developing their own sound, even in Western classical training. I know, I keep saying like, is it even possible? Of course it is possible in Western classical singing and Western classical training. So then and then this also kind of combines into this idea of asking for what you want. So we're asking for what you want and finding the students why, and understanding what they want to communicate and understanding who they are. Yes, and one of the things about this about just having this, being intentional about this, is that if we are working in this way, especially as independent voice teachers where we're working with young singers who may or may not know what they want, if we're working in this way, especially with young singers, we will have a better chance of avoiding the pitfall where do tell, Bianca, if you've got a light bulb moment there, or unless you're already, unless it's fine, but if you want to share, please do. We will have a better chance of avoiding the pitfall of where students are singing and working in the studio and doing something with you because they want to please you, right? Because they want your approval. So we will have a much better chance of avoiding the kind of damage, truly, the kind of damage, and I will use the word trauma here in its most intense sense, of avoiding the trauma that comes when we as teachers are imposing on students without listening and without having, even when we think we're listening to them, but if we're not being intentional about asking these questions and about working collaboratively and having student-led studios, we are far more likely to fall into that trap where students are doing something because it's what you want, and they want to please you, and they want to have your approval, especially when we're working with young singers. So I think if we kind of have this like turnaround, a little turnaround in our ideas around feedback and feed forward, I think that just kind of fits in really well. I agree, Bianca. I agree. I think there are a lot of hurting singers and performers and voice teachers out there who were harmed in their independent studio experiences, especially in their sort of high school years, and especially if we go back a generation or two, when we didn't have the same kinds of post-secondary school options too, right? So we have some far more post-secondary school options now, so that if you want to get a degree in singing, you don't have to just study classical, right, or Western classical. You can do some other things now, so there are more options, but we don't have that. But there are still lots and lots and lots of folks out there who, who have this kind of idea that the best way is the Western classical way, and so then students are being channeled in this way into doing what the teacher wants and into getting that approval from the teacher. But we can change. We can be the change. Oh, look at us. Look at all the platitudes. Let's throw them out there. We can be the change. But truly we can. Yeah. Terrific. Something to think about this weekend. I will see you on Monday, I think. Yeah, on Monday we're going to be talking about moving from exercises to performance, and some ideas about that and how the brain works a little bit, or how we learn a little bit of that. So I will see you on Monday. If you have not had a chance to check out my new website yet, now's a good time to do that. Just saying. It's up there. It's Dr. Shannon Coates, Dr. ShannonCoates.com. I'm particularly proud, as I've said before, I'm particularly proud of my customized social media icons. They're a little bit steampunky and kind of cool, so they're a little cooler than I am, if you will. Terrific. Have a great weekend, friends. I will see you next week. Let's end that one. Oh,